the Jaipur Literature Festival. We have with us today John, Ralston, Saul, Adrienne, Clarkson, and Jonathan Shainin, and the name of the session is Two Typewriters. I'm extremely excited to see what this is about, so I'm going to just pass it straight on to Jonathan to start.
Good afternoon. Can everyone hear me all right? I'm going to take that as a yes, since I apparently can't hear you very well. It's a huge honor to be here today with two very, very extraordinary writers and really sort of public intellectuals of the highest order. It's daunting to even introduce the two of them, but I'll try my best because they've both had such extraordinary careers. John Ralston Saul is a novelist and an essayist. He's the president of PEN International. His novels include Birds of Prey, which I believe was an international bestseller in the 1970s. Probably has been translated into how many languages?
25.
25 languages. And most recently a novel called Dark Diversions. John is an accomplished essayist whose books of nonfiction include Voltaire's Bastards, The Doubter's Companion, The Unconscious Civilization, and On Equilibrium. He's written a book, I think safe to say is about Canada, called Reflections of a Siamese Twin. And a book on globalization and its decline called The Collapse of Globalism. And with John is Adrienne Clarkson, who again has had a kind of public career that really defies summary. Began as a journalist, had a long association with the CBC for I think about 30 years. I believe I read while doing a little research that Adrienne, in her career in television journalism, hosted 3,500 programs. Becoming the Governor General of Canada, if you will, the Rashtrapati of Canada. Maybe that's not quite the right word, we'll see. And has herself written a memoir, which I have here, called Heart Matters. And is about to give the Massey Lectures in Canada. We'll be talking a bit about that. So the subject here is Two Typewriters, although as Adrienne pointed out when we had lunch today, neither of them actually types. Maybe we'll come to that. I wanted to start by asking both of you, at what point in your lives did you first see yourselves as writers? When did that become one of the sort of elements of your identity?
When I was in grade 6, I wrote a play for our school finale, which involved harvest and corn, and was about the imminent presence of the destruction of corn by a large wind and a lot of hail. And that was when I knew I could be a writer. I cast it myself, I directed it myself. I did not star in it because I didn't want to be a performer, but I knew I wanted to write.
And you were what, 12, 13?
No. Grade 6, I was just 10.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I was 10. And so I liked the idea of putting words in other people's mouths. And then I got rather hooked on the idea of putting words in my own mouth. But I got the other practice first.
And John, what about you?
Well, probably grade 9, because I noticed that in
He
all...
was dyslexic, so he was late.
I'm a left-handed dyslexic.
Okay.
And I noticed that in all the literary, where you were supposed to write, a story or an essay or something, I always got bad marks. And then I looked at what I'd written, and it was really good to me. And apparently I wasn't doing what the teachers wanted, which indicated that I was setting myself up to be a writer. And then later, if I'm allowed to say it with my wife sitting beside me, when I was doing my PhD and living in France, I was writing my first novel, and I was halfway through it, and I ended up...
and this was Birds of Prey, yes?
No, this was before it was never published.
Ah.
I ended up breaking up with a girlfriend because she wanted to go away on a holiday, and I had to finish the novel, and I realized that really indicated that I took writing seriously.
And so, Adrienne, you talk a bit about your career in journalism and how, I know that after John, you did a PhD, and then your first novel would have come out not long after that, I guess.
Yeah, because I drew The Birds of Prey more or less out of my PhD, which is a very bizarre thing to do.
And you two did graduate work, I believe, in English.
Yes, I did. He did his graduate work in political science, but I did my graduate work in English, and I did English language and literature, which was a very intense 4-year course at the time. I went to University of Toronto, very much based on the Oxford-Cambridge model, where you read everything in the English language in 4 years, from Anglo-Saxon on, from Anglo-Saxon to Beowulf to forever, Pope, right up to, well, modern stopped at Virginia Woolf when I was at university. But I had this wonderful idea that I was going to read everything in both English and French, and then I went off to France after doing my MA in Toronto. I wanted to become completely bilingual. And at the time that I was at university and in Canada, not very many Anglophones, or people of English first language, were very interested in doing their graduate degrees in France. And so I and 2 other friends went there. Everybody else of ours went off to either Columbia or Harvard or Oxford or Cambridge or LSE or University or King's College or whatever. But I thought Paris was it. And that was because when I was a little girl, I wanted to learn French when I was 5. And in the peculiarities of our country, you could not go to a French language school in Ontario unless you were a Roman Catholic.
Okay.
All right, I don't want to explain that.
There's a long explanation.
Yeah, you don't want that. That's
you
a
don't
subject.
have time for
yeah,
this.
that's a subject of another thing. And when I was taken, my parents, because we were immigrants and refugees in Canada, when I was 5 years old, I was taken to this convent, and I was all dressed up. I remember I had my black patent leather Mary Jane shoes on. I had a pink smock dress on. I was all best, and I remember the nuns in their wonderful outfits. I thought they were beautiful. Maybe it was just as well I probably would have become a nun. It was so attractive to me. And when we walked home, I knew something was wrong, and my father said, "You're not going to be learning French now, but if you behave well and go to school, when you finished university, I will send you to Paris." And he kept that promise to me,
Oh, wow.
as he kept every promise to me.
And so, tell me how you got into, what was it after doing your university degree and after doing the graduate work? What was it that drew you to journalism?
I wasn't drawn to journalism.
It was an accident.
No, it was a total accident. I wanted to be a writer. I read Room of One's Own by
now I'm
Virginia
forgetting
Woolf.
when I did my introduction, the audience will have to forgive me, that you have also published several novels.
Yes, I published novels in my 20s.
You two are so prolific and productive that it's
I published 2 rather embarrassing novels when I was in my 20s, and they are
Not
happily...
that bad.
I haven't reread them. He has. He read
well,
them
but
when
still,
we
I
met.
mean, focusing on this idea because we're going to be talking about how the two of you work together as writers or how you coexist as writers in a
But
partnership.
that's why I understood what writers wanted to be, because I always sort of thought I wanted to be it. Then I came back from France after doing my degree there in French. I came back and I was asked by somebody suddenly, who I had been at university with, if I would come on this television show and do book reviews, because they knew I knew about literature and so on. And I said, what will I have to do? And they said, you come into the studio, prepare a review of 3 books, just look into the camera and talk. I thought, well, that sounds like fun. So I did that, and they liked it. And so I was hired for $42.50 a performance, once every month, to review 3 books. And I did that, and I enjoyed it, and that's how I began my television career. I had no idea, but I knew I loved television. I walked into that dark studio. It was lit like this, only it was even darker. There were 3 cameras, and whenever you were on camera, the little red light went on. And to me, that was absolutely wonderful. And I took to it. Then they asked me to do interviews, and then after that, the woman who was running the show and had been doing it decided she was going to retire and go back to being an actress. And I was asked to audition in a great big cattle call with 38 women, most of whom were girlfriends of producers. I was not, and somehow they picked me. And from then on, I did television for nearly 30 years and started a number of shows.
Something I want to talk about, and we'll come fully to this later, is the idea of the relationship between a writer and a public, and the role that a writer and a public intellectual plays in a country. At a literary festival like this, I think I'm not saying anything out of turn by suggesting that television more broadly tends to be sort of looked down upon by literary types, and we don't think a lot about the act of writing for television and about that way of interacting with the public. Can you talk a little bit about you told me that you dictate, when you're writing now in print, you dictate because you became accustomed to that in your television years. What's it like to be a writer for a sort of public affairs program on television?
Well, first of all, it depends on the material that you're doing in public affairs. I started out by doing documentaries on really social problems and things, like children trying to find out who their parents were who had been adopted. This was not a well-known thing. When I started in television, we pioneered doing that kind of stuff. And so the writing that I did was collaborative. That's the first thing that's different. It's you sit down and you write something, then somebody else comes along and says, well, we're going to put the picture in here, and then you're told by anybody who you respect that when you're writing for television, it isn't radio with pictures.
Right.
So you don't write a whole thing and then drop in the pictures. It is the pictures and then the words come in, and sometimes if you do music, although most of my good mentors said you don't need the music, you need the words and the images to go together. But that helped me to discipline myself in terms of listening to the voice. And what I do when I write is that I dictate. And I dictate into a machine, my little tiny, now it's digital, and then I have a person who types that first draft for me and sends that right back to me. And then I go through that first draft, and the agony, Red Smith, the great sports writer, Time magazine, legendary, said, writing is really easy. You just get out the typewriter, you hang over it until little beads of blood form on your forehead. And that is exactly what the first draft is like. And so this, for me, the dictation gets it over, and the horrible first draft comes out, and you just start slashing away at it. Then I redictate it, and it comes back, and then I redictate it. Usually it's about 3 times. But it means that I can, unlike him, work when I come in for a dinner at night. If we've been out at 10:30 or so, I'm a night person anyway, sit down and work till 2 in the morning, and I love that magic time when there's nobody around and nothing, and the phone isn't going to ring, and there's nothing else in your mind, and you're not thinking about what am I going to cook for dinner tonight.
Well, so this is, I was about to go, you helped me here with the segue, like an experienced television writer, to John and his style of, well, John, maybe let's start, and I've now asked Adrienne about her television career and things like this. This kind of work that you've done as a sort of essayist, which I don't know if you'd be right to say it begins with Voltaire's Bastards. Would you,
Yeah.
which is 1993. How did you sort of shift from writing fiction to writing nonfiction? What was that, or writing books of nonfiction? What was that process like?
Well, I should say first that since you've got us together, one of the interesting things that linked us right from the beginning was that quite separately, before we knew each other, we'd had this relationship with French and with France.
Yes.
With French, Canada, and France.
So both of you said, for the audience who may not be familiar with Canada in this way, that it was unusual for people of your generation to be fully bilingual.
Yeah. Well, now half the bilingual people in Canada are Anglophones, and there's a big system to produce them. In those days, it wasn't the case, and you could count them on one hand. So the idea that, as Adrienne says, you'd go off to wherever, not to an Anglo place, and do your postgraduate was very unusual. And I got my PhD from London because I didn't want to spend the rest of my life explaining why I had the level 1, 2, or 3 of a French PhD. It's just too complicated. Right. But in fact, I spent my entire time in Paris because it was on de Gaulle. And also, I think the other thing which we really agree about is that if you have to be poor, which as a student you usually are, it's far better to be poor in Paris. I mean, London is an absolutely miserable place to be. And I remember I would leave King's College London with these sallow, almost green colleagues of mine with twitches in their faces because they were slaves of the professors under that English system. And I would just sail off to Paris and live in delightful poverty, having a wonderful, wonderful time.
Now, I should say, I think as a warning...
And you'd come back and there would be mold in their toes and things like that. And, and you were having this great time.
Do you think, we have a lot of students in the audience here usually at Jaipur. I think they might need to be warned that I'm not sure it's so easy to be poor in Paris today.
Well, I don't know. I'm not a student now.
I think it still is because they subsidize. So, you don't pay any fees. In France, you don't pay any university fees. You pay for where you live, and if you live in the Cité Universitaire, as I happened to for 3 years, which was an international city of students set up with Rockefeller money after the First World War, as part of that League of Nations thing of all countries will live together, therefore they won't make war anymore, they'll make love, etc., all of which was nonsense. But it did create this wonderful cité universitaire, and it meant that you could live there very cheaply, and you had student restaurants you could go to. They're all over Paris. You won't know them if you go there as
And have
tourists.
delightful
You could have
horse
a-
meat and things. I mean, it's
you
really,
could have a
it's no problem at all.
You have a 4-course meal that was the equivalent of 25 cents then. So nowadays it would maybe be $1 or $2, because it's all subsidized. And your trips, skiing trips and trips to various places, you belong to a student cooperative, and you got very wonderful rates to take on the train, to do all sorts of things. So and it would cost you more to go and buy a coffee at a cafe than it did for your entire 4-course meal, which included a quarter of a bottle of wine at lunch and at dinner.
Going to be a lot of people buying French textbooks in the audience here. So John, go back to,
So, you know, I always wanted to be a novelist. I started writing my first novel when I was about 18. I wrote 2 novels and a major play, major in length, not in quality. And then...
Tell them the name of the play.
Turnips.
Turnips.
Yes.
Yeah. It
It's
wasn't
a
destined. It was not destined.
Not destined to be ever produced.
No. And then I had this idea out of my PhD, which was really a French political novel, sort of Conradian, about the power of the military in France. And I knew I had to write it in a very fast way to get over the fact that it had come from the PhD. So it's very fast reading. And by that time, I'd gone back to live. I'd been living in France for 7 years. I went back to Canada to help set up our national oil company. I was assistant to a guy called Maurice Strong. It was a wonderful adventure. And then several trips, and it turned out that Le Seuil in Paris would publish this novel in French first. It was written in French first. And so I said to the head of the national oil company one day, you know, I need to take off 2 weeks because I'm going to go, I'm 29, I have to go and launch a novel in Paris. And he blinked. He said, okay. And I went off, and then this novel was an enormously scandalous success where I was violently attacked. The first 2 reviews were in Figaro and François, and I was called everything you can possibly be called.
Now, it was a scandal because it was a sort of political thriller that was set in Gaullist France. And did people think that it was meant to be an indictment of
It was, and they knew.
Okay.
And
it was a sort of roman à clef.
Sort of a roman à clef, and it put in question a whole range of people who were furious, and so the right-wing papers came after me.
And you're what, 29 at this time?
29, and I'm just this
And you set off a scandal in France.
And I'm this nice little boy from Canada, and I think I said at an earlier session, and I read these 2 things where I was called everything under the sun, and I thought to myself, what will my mother think? You know, because no experience of being under attack, right? And she'll be so embarrassed. What will she tell her friends? Sort of thing. And then Le Monde came out on my side, and the Libération came out on my side, and then I thought, this is sort of fun. You know, get a thick skin and get going, and it's a lot of fun.
So let me ask you to jump forward then to moving from, I know you still write fiction,
yeah.
But when you first decided, after a few novels, 4 novels, to do Voltaire's Bastards, which is the first book of essays, right? Or the first book of nonfiction, really. What was kind of going through your head as you formulated, okay, I'm going to write a nonfiction book now? I assume
I've been building up
to it.
I've been building up to it for 20 years. I had 20 years of work. Then I finally got to the day where my friends, my publishers and journalists were tired of hearing me explain my novels through my philosophy.
Okay.
You know, that I was actually clearly trying to write the book without writing it. And so I basically just said to everybody, I'm going to stop. I stopped for 5 years at least.
Yeah.
I didn't publish a book for I think 7 or 8 years, went deeply into debt. This is when you're very glad to have a very solid relationship.
Right.
Know?
Yes, and your wife works in television.
Yeah. And then came out of the blue with this book called Voltaire's Bastards, which again, like my first novel, the first 2 reviews were appalling. There was a major review in the New York Times by a right-wing guy and a major review in the Globe and Mail by a left-wing guy. Absolutely appalling.
They both hated it.
Hated it. Identical reasons on the left and the right. They agreed totally. And so I wrote these 1,000-word replies, which were quite aggressive, to put it mildly, which were published. And then Camille Paglia came out with the cover of the Washington Post book review saying that every single American student had to read this, every American had to read this,
Well,
etc. And then it all turned around, and people decided it was a work of considerable whatever.
So,
and it's still in print all around the world today, and you know.
So let me ask you both. I mean, we've you know, how do your part of our rubric here, right, is the relationship between the two of you as writers, you know, and partners. How would you describe? Adrienne has talked a little bit about her style of working. How would you describe your style of working, and how would you describe the way that your styles kind of interact with one another?
Well, I'm really very simple. I'm completely obsessional, and I basically, you know, work away at it behind the scenes without writing until I get to the point where I feel like I'm going to vomit, and then I go away somewhere.
Okay.
And I used to go to hotels until mass tourism drove up the price of hotels, and also there was piped music in every single room, and you couldn't go and sit anywhere without listening to Frank Sinatra, edited to be followed by Mozart, to be followed by, you know, whatever. And then friends would lend me their houses because you didn't want to be in your own house. You wanted to be somewhere in a vacuum, you know. And so I'd disappear for a month or 6 weeks. I remember writing a novel that takes place in the monsoon season in the Shan States in Burma, and I was writing it in January in Venice, in Ruskin's pension. And of course, every morning was flooded like this, right? So I felt like I was in Burma, except I was in Venice.
Right.
And so I've always gone away somewhere. Now I mainly write, and I think Adrienne does a bit as well. We have an island in the near north in Canada on something called Georgian Bay. We have a little 2-acre island.
It's the arm of Lake Huron, for those who are familiar with the Great Lakes in the center of North America. And it's an archipelago of 30,000 rock islands, which are 1,800,000,000 years old. And we have our own island, which is a hectare, which is 2 acres. So it's our own little kingdom. And we don't have electricity or running water on it. And that's one of the...
And a great outhouse.
Yeah, great outhouse.
The outhouse with the greatest view.
Well, so what I want to know, though, here is...
So I go there to write. I've written a lot of stuff
How do
there.
you two... Now, at what point do you show your work to one another?
As late as possible.
As late as possible.
Almost never.
Once and as late as possible.
That's it. So it's not a collaborative process where you're one another's editors.
Not that part of it.
No.
You don't want to be interfered with. I mean,
No, you don't want to be interfered with. That's the thing. You mustn't. You know.
But you do feel like you benefit, I assume, from
yes, we benefit. The rest of our lives match perfectly. I mean, the thing is that, you know, we're best friends because, as Michael Oakeshott said, he says a wonderful thing in one of his writings. John doesn't like me to quote Michael Oakeshott. He says too right wing or something. But I like Michael Oakeshott, okay? And Michael Oakeshott says that friendship is the contemplation of the other. If you can contemplate another person and really enjoy them, you will be friends. If you start to want to change them, you are not friends. And I believe that's true of husbands and wives as well.
It sounds like it's true of manuscripts too, right?
Maybe.
You want to contemplate one another's manuscript, but you don't want the other person changing it.
I do hear the ideas as we're going along, and I think he hears mine, although I tend to be more retentive than he does. He's more voluble. I'm not. And
I like to hear them.
Yeah, he talks a lot. And he talks a lot.
So I have a sense that Adrienne is more deliberative, or more deliberate rather, and you want to explore 10 or 15 or 20 ideas before you settle on what you're going to do.
When I was Governor General, we spent a lot of time with the native peoples of Canada. And the West Coast people, there's one tribe, there's a lot of tribes in the West, but the one on the Queen Charlotte Islands, as you would call them, which by their name is Haida Wai, are the Haida people, most extraordinary. And they looked at us.
One of the most mystical places in the world.
It's the most wonderful.
Has anybody been there?
It's a wonderful place.
One person. Oh gosh, this is
I see three or four people out there.
Anyway, they say...
Yeah, we've got a very Canadian audience here.
No, I don't. They're not necessarily Canadian.
They looked at us.
This is a very mystical place.
They looked at us and they said that he was the raven and I was the eagle. The raven is busy looking all over the place and says, you know, chatters away and does things and is curious. And the eagle just watches things. And I think that and then makes deliberative. And that comes from our backgrounds as children and what happened to us when we were children.
If I may say.
Yes.
The raven in indigenous mythology is the one who uncovers the sun and the stars. Plays the role of God. But if I'm allowed to say that. But he's equally a troublemaker. He's very much like a writer.
Yeah.
This sounds very insightful, actually. I mean, I've only known the two of you for a day, but I think they got it.
The thing is, anyway, with the manuscript, sometimes I read it when it comes back in its first draft from the publisher.
Okay.
Okay, when it's in its first draft and before it's put into the galleys, because I have a kind of brain that is instinctively a copy editor's brain. I am one of the great copy editors of all time, although I've never done it for a living. And I can spot a typo or anything. I mean, anybody wants me to read their book first time, I'll find all the typos in their first edition and give it back to them. And it just happens that I just read like that. And so I find all the typos, and then I give them general ideas of what I think. And that's it. And I never read it again until maybe about 5 years later I might read his book.
And John, when you read something Adrienne has written, now, I
No,
know
he reads sort of more intense. Actually, he edited one of my books, the biography of Norman Bethune.
Mentioned at lunch.
Yes, yeah.
Once in my life, I edited a series of 18 biographies
For Penguin.
For Penguin, which was about 18 of the key modern dead Canadians.
So
and so Adrienne, completely. You've got someone in the family who's a really good writer, and she's.
Well, I saw the list on his desk that he was talking to the editor at Penguin about, the list of Canadians, and I spotted Norman Bethune, and I said, could I do that? And so they said, sure, you can do that. No, he said, sure.
Well,
so I thought it was a great idea.
I don't want to detour too
First
much, but
woman to write about Norman Bethune.
Tell the audience who may not know very quickly who Norman Bethune
Norman
is.
Bethune is the greatest Canadian who ever lived, and who is known by the most people in the world because he is known by name to 1,200,000,000 Chinese. He is a hero of the revolution. He was the doctor for the 8th Route Army in 1937-38 when the Japanese invaded China, and he went to see Mao Zedong in the caves in Hunan, and Mao Zedong in one memorable night said, go and be the doctor for these 13 million people in the Northwest, and he went and he spent nearly a year with them, operating under tremendously difficult circumstances, setting up what became, in the end, the barefoot doctor kind of tradition, setting up little medical schools to help paramedicals become paramedicals. He had been in the Spanish Civil War where he had invented ambulatory transfusions, and he was an extraordinary, extraordinary human being. And I was really, when he died, which he died as a martyr really because there were no rubber gloves left, and he put his hand into a wound to turn something in a bone of somebody, and he was pierced and got septicemia and died within 10 days. And immediately he was virtually sanctified by the Chinese, and within 3 weeks Mao Zedong wrote an essay about him called In Honor of Norman Bethune, which when we first went to China for a long trip in 1979, everybody, when they knew you were Canadian, looked up at you and started this, by memory, this essay, because they were made to memorize it in grade 5.
So I want to use this as an opportunity here. John, you as the editor of this series, there's so many things to talk about yet, Canada and citizenship and all these things. But since we're here in India, you worked on this series of biographies. There's a great essay by Ram Guha, who's one of the great, maybe the greatest living Indian historian, called Why South Asians Don't Write Biographies. And Ram, in this essay, which is in his book, I believe, The Last Liberal, if anyone wants to look at it, is making a plea for Indians to tell the stories of more Indian lives. And to kind of to produce these biographies, and he goes through this long list of major figures in the independence movement and after independence whose biographies have never really been written. What was your motive in doing this series in Canada, and what would you say to someone here as an encouragement to take up that kind of work?
Well, I've always been interested by the idea that there are ways of conveying ideas which haven't really been tried, or they have been partially tried. And so, Voltaire's Bastards, The Unconscious Civilization, others are reimaginings of how you would make an argument. They're not the normal way. They're sort of written like novels and so on. And so I've written I had written two books about Canada, which were, as I think someone was explaining to you, a completely different approach to mythology. Because, mythology is true or not true. And the question is, can you find a way to create a mythology which is truer?
Right.
And interesting, that in a sense mythology can either be there to enchain people.
And by mythology here, you mean a kind of an idea of Canada.
A
that
story, an
Canadians-
idea, a form of imagination.
form
You
of
get out of
narrative.
bed in the morning. How are you going to take the next 5 steps? Ethically, who are you? Why are you there? What are you doing? And so that can be kind of 19th century nationalism. That can be not so bad or not so good. You know, it can be racist. It can be religionist. Or it could be kind of an interesting way of how you relate to other people. And so I wrote these books which were really quite unusual, and they changed quite a bit of the vocabulary of Canadians and how they talk about themselves, their basic myths. They stopped using certain phrases and started using phrases that I'd come up with, which were reimagined ways of doing it. Anyway.
In Indian terms, we would say you're the sort of Sunil Kilnani of Canada.
It was things like, we used to say we were 2 founding peoples, French and English, and multicultural, which is a terrible phrase. And I started things saying it was the country built on 3 founding cultures, which was Aboriginal, Francophone, and Anglophone. And that sort of idea that the Aboriginals were a central part of the myth of the country. And
the idea of Canada.
Yeah, changed completely the way people thought about themselves. So anyway, when Penguin said to me, would you do this? I said, only if I can completely imagine it in a new way. And my idea was that it would be one story, and that I would choose well-known writers, of whom only one turned out to be a biographer. There was a philosopher, there was an ex-head of state, there was, you know, all good.
Doug Copeland.
Doug Copeland, who did Marshall McLuhan.
Right.
And that in a way they would try to tell these stories in a very short form, about 200 pages, as part essay, part mythology, part biography, which only a really good writer can do.
Right.
So it's not at all in the classic modern biographical school. It's really quite, on the one hand, storytelling, on the other hand, highly intellectual. And editing it, you could see the pieces fitting together. And I would have to, my job was to sort of say to them, well, do you realize that so-and-so, you say was a Protestant who did this, but if look at over this person as being, having their biography done, did they sleep together? Did they go to school together? Did they argue with each other? So you started to get this thing of a plain, which was civilization, and these mountains, which are these biographies. And they were sending signals to each other. And it ended up that the 18 writers had a lot of conversations with each other. We had dinners where there would be 5 or 6 or 10 of us.
time.
Did all the books come out at once?
No, 3 at a time, 3 every 6 months.
Oh, okay.
But we had dinners together.
Well, I don't know if there are any publishers in the audience, but I think a project like this would be a
I think
would be a
for
wonderful
India it
one.
would be fabulous.
Oh, yeah.
It would be-
Yeah.
if it hasn't been done, I can imagine a project like that in
So
India.
let me ask, while we're on the subject...
And the idea, the shortness of it,
Under
forces
200 pages.
Yeah. I
mean, it
It comes
forces
in
you
at
to
about
focus on
42,000 words, I
both
guess.
the reality and the myth in the same book. If it's long, well, you do tend to get
No
into, we got on the
footnotes.
train at
There were
12
certain
o'clock,
rules.
you know?
No footnotes. Under 200 pages.
These are meant to be a sort of, it's meant to be a sort of composite popular history of Canada.
No, it's not.
In some ways.
It's not a populist dumbed down at all.
Oh, no, I mean popular, not populist.
Well,
Are those
it's
the same
meant to
thing?
be extremely well-written interpretations by extremely good writers, all of whom had major publics.
You know that one of the models is Talleyrand by Duff Cooper, right?
Yeah. Or Strachey, I suppose.
Yeah, no,
you
but
know.
those 4 eminent Victorians,
Right,
those
right.
are short. The Talleyrand by Duff Cooper is one of the greatest biographies ever written about an
I
extremely
believe the
complicated.
biography prize is named for Duff Cooper as a result. Yeah.
I mean, really amazing.
So let me ask you guys, while we're on the subject of Canada, which we could talk about for a great long time, I think one or both of you said something interesting to me earlier, which was that each of you were outsiders. Can you both expand on that a little bit? Let's start with Adrienne.
Well, I definitely. I mean, it's all when here I'm introduced as the ex-Governor General of Canada, that people say, "Oh, really?" And I think they're being polite too, because Canada is a most unusual country. We always had British Governors General until 1952, when the first Canadian citizen became Governor General, Vincent Massey, an extraordinary man. And from then on, we have had Canadian Governors General. And so basically, I am a Canadian Governor General who is the first immigrant to Canada to become Governor General. Not only was I an immigrant, but I was a refugee, and I was a refugee from a war. And I came to the country when I was 2 years old with my parents on a Red Cross boat, where we did not really know that we where we were going to go and how we would pick up. We had one suitcase each, my mother, my father, my brother who was 7, and me who was 3. We had just lived through a war that had happened right over us. My father was in the war. He was working. He was a dispatch rider with the British, with the Royal Hong Kong Volunteer Militia, which of course then became active and wasn't a militia. And we hid in basements while the Japanese rampaged all over our city and violated our apartment and sold all our belongings in the street. And all of this is imprinted in my bloodstream, if you like. I have not realized until I knew that I would someday have to come to terms with it in myself. But when I began to write my autobiography, it became clearer to me, really by writing about my mother and my father, what that meant, what it meant to them, and how I came to realize what it meant to them. And I couldn't write the autobiography until they were both dead. I really could not. And so I did that, and so I have this little communication sometimes with my father where I have little discussions with him about it. And I think he basically kind of approves of it because he approved of virtually everything I ever did. And that is a key to, I guess, to my life. And my outsiderness is basically only looks like outsiderness because what Canada is a country where it is so permeable that you can penetrate Canada and become part of Canada. And Canada has a wonderful philosophy of benevolent neglect, which is that they let you be, they don't try to harm you, and they don't try to do anything for you particularly, except we have a wonderful social system, basically. We have medical care, we have wonderful public education that's free. That's why we have a successful immigrant country. We take 250,000 immigrants a year. We make them citizens because they can't come into Canada unless we've planned to make them citizens. They come to be landed immigrants. They do not come, as in the United States, to be resident aliens.
Right. Well, what's interesting, you contrast.
So 85% of the immigrants become citizens within 4 to 5 years.
Well,
in the United States, it's 40%.
I just want to finish this
In
thought
Europe, it's about 7%.
about the being permeable.
7%
The society is permeable and therefore a wonderful one for immigrants, because if you go to public school and you decide you're going to learn French, that gives you a little extra thing. You just work harder, and that's what my father always said. He looked around, he said, if you just work hard, you're going to get right to the top and you will be the top of the top. And he told me that when I was 5. And so I never doubted that, and Canada never betrayed me in any way. Doors opened because I worked hard, I went to university, I did all the things I wanted to do, and it became a country where it is very, very easy to succeed if you don't, become a criminal.
Right.
And if you don't have...
Well, that's not necessarily going to eliminate you.
No, it doesn't necessarily. But that outsiderness helped me to be an insider. I don't know if that makes any sense.
Well, no, it makes perfect sense. And what's an interesting contrast for me as an American, because in America, there's this great pride in the sense of the melting pot.
Yeah.
But in fact, the melting pot forces you to melt.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
We're going to allow you a degree of assimilation, or we're going to force you to have a degree of assimilation. John, let me ask you, though, this outsider question, because you said your family has been in Canada since the 18th century.
Yeah, well, on the surface, I'm an insider because I come from what we call a loyalist family, which were the people who opposed the American Revolution. Mainly poor people, mainly racial minorities or religious minorities. They were either German religious minorities, Irish Catholics, Scottish Catholics, black, a lot of freed slaves, natives.
Came
The
right
English,
after the Revolution.
Yeah.
the English stayed because the English won. It was a sort of civil war between the English in England and the English in the United States. I mean, look at who signed the Declaration of Independence, right?
Yeah.
They're not the Scots, the Irish, the Germans, right? And so we were part of that fleeing, losing everything, and they ended up in Ontario. But what's interesting about the family is every generation married an immigrant, including me, over, since 1780.
And that's quite typical in Canada.
It's fairly typical.
Yeah,
I mean,
people marry immigrants.
But the peculiarity is that my father came from Winnipeg, a prairie city, and like a lot of young men, joined up immediately in 1939-40 and found himself in England by, I think, late 1940, and landed on D-Day in the first wave, fought in North Africa and things. But after the war, he married an English war bride, my mother, who came from a Scottish army officer family, which in the late 19th century became an Indian army family, because two brothers, my grandfather and his brother, came out from Sandhurst in the late 1890s to India, and both served as officers in the Rajputs on the frontier in the north, which all the Indians will know this.
I want to ask
And
you
so,
guys,
sorry,
go ahead.
but the outsider part is that Canada is a country where the army is except in the two wars, is not of great importance. It's very small, and when the wars are over, it recedes into the background. It's very small. So I was brought up on these army bases, sort of in a Russian novel on the steppes, you know, in the West, with thousands of miles of wheat fields and plain around you. And this little band of boys and girls who were sort of really, we were almost vagrants, we were really left alone. And this little world, which is a completely outsider world to your normal Canadian. And you know, we don't have those. We don't have films made about us. We don't have.
There's no Hoosiers.
We're not an empire army or anything. So that you actually produced out of that quite strange people, out of that little world of being the outsiders and being the army brats and so on.
So we're about to run out of time, and we'll take questions from the audience. But now that we're on the subject of Canada, belonging, let me ask both of you as my last question. You know, I opened by talking about how I think, you know, the two of you both are exemplary public intellectuals. You know, both in your role as writers, in your public role, and Adrienne's role as the Governor General, John, in your work at Penn. I believe both of you are affiliated with or have founded a citizenship
Institute for Canadian Citizenship.
So
to help new citizens get involved.
So focus just here for the moment on writing and thinking. What you know, either in your experience in Canada or more broadly, how do each of you think about what the role is of the writer in a kind of public discourse, in a public culture? What is unique to what a write?
Look, books are either good or they're bad, or somewhere in between. So you just get on with it, and you're either somebody, you can be any kind of writer. You could be the kind of writer who's writing very difficult of access things, or they could be romantic things. I think, as it turns out, both Adrienne and I write things that a lot of people want to read in our country, but also, in my case, you know, around the world. And it's, Adrienne would be the same, but she's written about Canada,
right,
know, mainly. And then you sort of decide, are you the kind of person who doesn't want to go out the door? To what extent are you willing to go out the door? Will you go to literary festivals? It's a first step. You know, this is an unusual literary festival. It's a lot of fun. It's really great. A lot of them are not this great, you know. But, you know, I made a decision in the 90s that once I started writing my essays, sort of political philosophy, that I'd go into halls and give speeches.
Right.
And which is the complete opposite, because you're speaking without notes or with a few notes, and you're doing kind of a 19th century oral oration and then entering into a dialogue. So it's different from Michael Sandel, with whom I worked this morning, but it's still in the same school as him. I was a very conscious choice. 1993, I bring out this big book, and I said, I'm going to go into the halls and see if anyone will come. And then people started coming. And that sort of public discourse exchange is really exciting, I think.
I think the public discourse is very important, and I see the person who was most important in my life, besides my mother and father, was my high school English teacher, Mr. Walter B. Mann, who was a socialist of the Fabian order, and who ran for a Canadian Socialist Party as a candidate perpetually and lost his deposit. He got so few votes. But he was a wonderful English teacher, and he was the one who spotted me. He said to me, "You are going to be a public speaker, and I'm going to train you to win the public speaking contest that the Rotary Club puts on in Ottawa." And so from the time I was in grade 11 till I was at the end of grade 12, I was trained by him to give talks, to speak, to write speeches, to make people want to listen to them, and to, of course, then memorize them, because he thought it was very important that you never read from a text. When I was Governor General of Canada, I used to give on average, 400 speeches a year.
And my understanding is that many of these were in your, you did a lot of different things as Governor General, but that the speeches you gave certain speeches in particular was that this was something that you obviously were putting a lot of energy
Yes,
into,
yes.
and that people who were following you as Governor General were seeing these as very important interventions in public debates.
I felt they were important. I made them important. I worked very hard on them. I had 2 people on my staff who did nothing but do research, and I was known as the only Governor General who ever quoted Thucydides on a regular basis. and that's because my education is classical. And so therefore, you know, I think that I considered those 6 years when I was Governor General to be very important as the way in which I talked to public people when they were expecting just to fall over dead with boredom when you walked into the room, and that it would only be ritual. And in ritual, using ritual appropriately, you can actually say good things, because people are so unprepared for the fact that you might say something that you catch them on, you know, off guard, and you actually
They got
penetrate
used
them.
to you saying something.
Yeah, I guess they did.
So that's.
I should just say
yeah.
that we do it completely the opposite. Adrienne works very hard and produces very structured speeches, which are rhetoric in the great sense of the word
classical
rhetoric.
sense, yes.
Yeah, great rhetoric.
No, it's deliberate too.
Deliberate rhetoric. And I sort of worry and worry and worry, and then about 5 days before I start writing notes, and then I come up with a thing that's all written out in notes only, and then I get in the car to go there, and inevitably halfway there I rip them up and throw them away.
And then you just talk.
And then I just talk. So I mean, we're just completely the opposite, which is probably why we get on. I don't
Works
know.
very well. Let's take some questions from the audience. We only have about 10 minutes. We could talk here for another few hours, I think. Has anyone got a question? Let's try and keep them short if we can. Anyone? I've got more. Oh, yep, go ahead.
I am very happy that both of you are speaking French and you wrote in French. I want to ask you whether you think there is a real war, as our publishers in France, they say, between Anglophony and Francophonie.
There's a what?
Between Anglophone writers and Francophone writers. I mean,
Did you ask if there's a
France,
war?
No, I mean...
A war?
No.
wall?
Language war.
No. Oh, a wall.
No, sure not. But in France, they really feel that they are not enough represented in either publishing house. In France, we buy a lot of others' languages, old novels,
Wait, so the
essays.
question is...
The question is...
I know what the question
Oh,
is.
got it. Okay, go ahead.
Okay. The question is why there is not the more representative of French writers and authors, because we have wonderful in United States, in Canada, in Anglophone.
Very good. All right, I'll let John field this.
You know, I think there's 2 things. One is a good thing and the other is a bad thing. The good thing is that English has become, it's not taking over. In fact, I would say, if anything, it's regressing in influence. I think local languages are coming back, or local or national languages are coming back, or regional languages. But English has this peculiarity of existing in so many forms. I mean, India, how many forms of English are there in India? How many forms of English are there in Africa? England, the United States. You know, you don't have the enormous basis of production of literature in such variety as there is in English. So I think people in English feel that they've already got the translations because they're living in India reading Canadian or vice versa or whatever. I think the other is that there's, a loss of language skills in the intellectual class all over the Western world. That it used to be that the sign of an intellectual, which a writer is, was that they spoke 4 languages.
Right.
If not 5 or 6. And somehow, after the Second World War, with a sort of period of the rise of nationalism, a new wave of nationalism, writers became, and I talked about this the other day, writers gradually became somehow an expression of localness, which is okay, which is good, while forgetting the other side of being a writer, which is that they are the transmitters of ideas across borders. And to do that, you actually have to speak and write in several languages, maybe not write your books in several languages, but really function in that way. And I think that the Anglophones have lost that to a great extent, but The French didn't have it in that period at all. The Germans didn't really have it. It was really a drying up of multilingualism as an intellectual quality among writers. And I think we really have to, I mean, I go to these meetings. I found myself in a meeting in Africa with a whole bunch of writers, and I was the only one who was bilingual. The colonial effect was that half of them spoke English and the other half spoke French. And I was supposed to be there presiding, and instead of that, I became the servant translator of the entire meeting. You know, it's a very peculiar situation we're in. So I mean, Indians, I think, have languages more, and I think the Indian writers would tend to have what? 2 at minimum, 3?
2, 3, 4. I mean,
2, 3, 4
you know.
languages. So they're way ahead of us in that sense, way ahead. You know, Northern Europe, Central Europe, but Western Europe, North America, no.
The fellow back there with the glasses.
Hi, you spoke earlier about Canada's uniqueness in the world, and as another Canadian living abroad, I often find myself trying to explain Canada's unique position and its relationship with America specifically and the rest of the world. And often I also find myself defending Canada, having to try and justify our existence in the world. I was wondering if either of you or both of you feel similarly.
I don't feel I ever have to defend Canada. Canada defended me. And I don't think in any other country I would have had the life that I've had. Only in Canada could somebody like me have had the life I had. I don't see it as happening in the United States. I once asked my father, because when you grow up as a survivor of a cataclysm, which is the way now I am able to put it to myself. When I was little and even when I was younger, I like to think of myself as perfectly ordinary and like any other girl. But of course I really wasn't. And I've only begun to, as I've grown up, realize that's not the case. And so I said to my father, what would have happened if there hadn't been a war in Hong Kong and you just kept on? He was a very successful businessman, even he was only 32. He was very successful. He had the Opel agency of cars. He had a lovely life. We had served, you know, it was a wonderful life. And he said, well, you know, we would have, because you were very smart, we would have sent you to the United States. We would have picked probably Radcliffe or Wellesley, good girls' colleges for you, and we would have been very happy for you to go there, and that would have been your future. So then I extrapolated from that. If I'd done that, I would probably have married somebody American. And I would have lived in New York.
Someone like you.
Exactly.
If you were lucky.
That's right.
I would have married somebody American. I would have lived in the United States, and I would not have become the Governor General of Canada. I would not have had, I'm convinced, I wouldn't have had the opportunities I had in Canada.
Now, let me interpolate something from between you and the questioner, which is, what do you think, though, what makes other people think that Canada's dull or kind of, you know, what's
Well,
sort of...
because we're this sullen little people. We're very happy because we have a wonderful country and we want to keep it in many ways to ourselves. And we have a very wonderful, you know, we have our medical system, we have our public schools, we have the most beautiful scenery you've ever seen in the entire world, and we have everything. And we are, you know, we are nice to each other because we have so much, we just are, because we're so used to being diverse. 1/2 of the population of Toronto, our largest city, which is 4 million people, 1/2 of the population of that city was not born in Canada. And
really
we all live in harmony. And when I'm in the subway, I see people, and it's just the whole world in one subway car. And I just realize that we are unique in the world. And it's our uniqueness that we are kind of wordless about. We don't know, as Canadians yet, how to express our uniqueness.
Let me put this slightly in a different way. I mean, I'm very wary of nationalism. We have a lot of flaws. There are a lot of things we've done wrong. I think the interesting thing, and I think it relates in a curious way to the Indian experience and possibility, which is that, you know, there's a European model of the modern nation state, the Westphalian monolithic nation state. This brilliant, rationally based, Enlightenment-produced model is one of the most violent things that's ever existed. 100 million people dead in the 20th century, constant banning of minority languages, constant banning of religions, in the desperate attempt to create racial, linguistic, cultural and mythological purity, the monolithic model. And all of us, coming out of the empires, are sort of feel obliged because of our university system to imitate it in some way, to feel that we also are the product of that system.
This is, I believe, Partha Chatterjee called this the epistemological straitjacket
Exactly.
of post-colonial nationalism.
And so,
Yeah,
so I
exactly.
think that when you look at a country like India, you are not looking at the Westphalian model. And to the extent that the universities, in any way through philosophy or anything, are helping the delusion that one should be in the Westphalian model, they're doing a very bad thing. Canada also is surprisingly not at all the Westphalian model. From the very beginning, it was at least three-parted, Aboriginal, Francophone, Anglophone. It's always been a massively immigrant society. It's always been regional. It's always been non-monolithic. So now we have we are the oldest continuous democratic federation in the world. You broke up, you had a civil war, etc.
This is true.
France, Germany, Italy, Spain, go through them all.
Yeah.
Switzerland came just after us.
Right.
Yeah. Much smaller proposition, complicated.
You've got one of those lines that says, X days since the last Civil War.
That's right, exactly. So since 1848, we've basically been in the same system, without a coup d'etat, without a civil war, without, dictatorship. And a central element in that is avoiding clarity, avoiding certainty.
Avoiding this Westphalian Enlightenment. What is it that defines us as a nation?
Yeah, avoiding those fabulous phrases that say, oh, well, we're wonderful lovers, or we're great capitalists, or, these simplified phrases that identify a country. Instead of that, we're constantly confusing about it because through confusion, we survive. It's a form of respect. Constant uncertainty, and I've always said that we have this old Constitution, and we're still negotiating it. And I'm convinced if ever we finish the negotiations of the Constitution, we'll fall apart. We just have to keep negotiating and talking and being uncertain about it.
I think that is precisely the right note for us to end on. Thank you, everyone, for listening. Thank you to John.